Hello, in this video I want to continue the conversations that we've been having about Deleuze and Guattari on the worker strike resolution coming up for LD. I think that it's a really interesting resolution to have conversations about Deleuze and Guattari because I think they have so much to say about the way in which we think about like how various movements are created, along what lines and subject positions they are, and the way that relates to like how they should present themselves in relationship to the state and what types of like tactics and other things can be performed. And I think there are a lot of really interesting ways to kind of interact with this debate from all angles, and so I definitely in this series want to try to cover as many as possible. If this is your first time kind of hearing about like Deleuze and Guattari in this particular context, I would definitely say watching some of the earlier videos, even if it's just the intro to Deleuze and Guattari, because that kind of gives you some of my core thoughts on just like what I think the key terminology and key ideas from Deleuze and Guattari are in their works that I think will be most pertinent in this upcoming resolution from whatever kind of like literature-based people are quoting them from. Or I think just being able to kind of like tap into some of the other conversations we're having about the role of Deleuze and Guattari on the neg and some of its central problems with like the question of the state's recognition or the government's recognition of the worker strike are really important places to have conversations about like what resistance looks like and the way that we should think about like what lines it should be created on and the like possibilities for like the resolution basically to be able to resolve some of the kind of like criticisms that are being made of like how governance produces particular forms of violence and violent forms of consumption, etc. And so in this video I kind of want to continue on with that kind of lecture series, starts talking a little bit about what these arguments Deleuze and Guattari look like on the affirmative for the worker strike resolution, just kind of thinking about what the best form of these arguments could be and how you really kind of want to use them to be able to answer the go-to case arguments that people will read, the framework and T arguments that people will read, K arguments, counterplans, and disads, and just kind of like covering all of those bases. I think that generally when we're just kind of starting off just thinking about what are some of like the best models for what these affirmatives look like, I think that the first thing that you want to do is really kind of establish why the idea of working through the stasis of kind of like solely the identity of the worker as a form of kind of like universal identity to enfold resistance in only kind of feeds into the power in which like the state is basically able to participate in the gridding of identity in such a way that produces forms of like separation, forms of violence, individualism, etc., because of the way that it provides only a way for us to think about violence and the way that we resist violence under the terms of like what's currently like understood as kind of like the human and what is kind of like locused around a particular kind of like centralized identity for like what that human looks like. And I think that being able to use that as the kind of like base reason of why you're kind of like indicting some of the structures from which the kind of like stability of that category really comes from allows you to bring out a lot of different diverse types of like impacts from those arguments and allows you to really develop a strong central criticism of like why the worker as a paradigm is kind of like a bad starting point for how we should be thinking about resistance in terms of the resolution as a whole. I then think that then starting to make central arguments about how the resolution kind of like opens itself up as kind of like the primary vacuole for how the state normatively is able to consume resistance and attempts to like turn war machines into something for its usage and deploying like various forms of like militancy and governance. And I think that allows you to really get really interesting in routes to allow the like crackdown and emergency kind of management arguments about like how the state responds to other forms of resistance that aren't recognized under what like the law, for instance, would under this type of case. And I think there are a lot of really good arguments to be made about like how the combination of those things really making it hard to think about a world in which the particular usage of the state as something that is like necessary in order to make that resistance legitimate is something that is good for the overall like continuation of resistance broadly, or whether or not it kind of like only cements the divisions between various types of like forms of subject and identity building that are based in trying to create false universalisms and the like easily griddable understanding of like locusing resistance into particular places and nodes that are like much more manageable by the state itself, all of which I think are really important to like think of as angles, including like then when you pile that on top of like how that is kind of like done through the mechanism of like a human rights framework, you have a lot of really interesting places to kind of work off of why every segment of the resolution is kind of like problematic in its relationship to how we're thinking about what Deleuze and Guattari would kind of consider a better form of thinking about what our relationship to desire, what our relationship to resistance and deterritorialization should be. And I think that when you're trying to then transition that to a method argument, there are so many good arguments to be made about like war machines in terms of like things like the pink war machine, arguments that people have been making in terms of like Dark Deleuze and the way that carries on to the various other things like destituent power and other forms of just evacuating or refusing the state's ability to be seen as like powerful or as something that like creates or that is able to control like what types of resistance or means of survival are like legitimate, which is I think really important in terms of just having like a strong set of bases to cover like what the method is going to look like, because then I think you can trace that into other examples where movements that have specifically chosen to destitute, make a mockery of, or refuse the proper terms of engage in the state have been productive. And I think that when that kind of transitions outside of just how you're explaining the case debate, and you kind of like get to a question of how you should be using this to implicate the framework in T debate, we've had such a lengthy discussion about how like there are different portions of indicting the topic and really specific methods that kind of like show why that specific refusal is good. I feel like from the very jump, you're either making a really good argument about like why the topic inevitably has this kind of like hole in it for like other ways in which we can theorize and think about like where the locus of resistance should be, but also additionally, I think it also sets you up to kind of pivot yourself into an even more offensive set of arguments that are just like refusing the kind of like terms of the state are necessary to think about what resistance looks like outside of the terms of governance and lawfare. And I feel like being able to kind of like situate those arguments as direct indites of the types of education, procedural norms, and kind of like stasis that the other team is trying to provide through their interpretation, you actually kind of end up with like this straight up impact turn debate that I think a lot of teams really wouldn't be expecting, but I think actually loads you up for a lot of offense, because the exact same type of like universalism that you're critiquing from like the paradigm of the resolution that we've talked about earlier is the exact same paradigm that they're kind of like using in order to identify like what ways of engaging the topic are good and are topical. And I feel like there are only like so many obviously like plan texts that are like topical on the resolution as a whole, probably, that I think that it'll be really hard for them to like win, that their like interpretation of how people should debate shouldn't be basically like just like very linear or one-dimensional, considering the ways in which like they require a particular engagement that can only recognize the legitimacy of like the state's ability to like engage and recognize the existence of like particular types of movements that can only be kind of like locus around like the worker and the position of the worker, which I think is like a really important place to kind of like think about like where we should be not just theorizing resistance itself, but also like what role debate plays in basically engaging and kind of coercing us into the institutional norms that make such an idea like the resolution like seem palpable, and engaging that as like the primary reason of like why continuing to engage on that basis only does the kind of like policing of desire and other things that we've kind of like suggested have already proven like the impacts that we've talked about throughout the entire video. So hopefully this is a good start and really helpful for you to think about like the other ways that you can read Deleuze and Guattari on the affirmative for this upcoming resolution. And yeah, thank you as always.